Okay, this is Connie Rufner. I am going to be the interviewer, and we are interviewing Dean Reichenbaugh in Canning, Pennsylvania. Dean, so when were you born?
October 9th, 1925.
And you lived through the Great Depression and through World War II.
Yes.
First, let me say thank you very much for your service. You told us that you were that you went to the Army. You weren't even quite out of high school yet.
I was in the Navy.
The Navy, I'm sorry. You were in the Navy. And you weren't quite out of high school yet when you left?
Well, they took me my last year in high school. I had enough credit that I would have graduated in the spring, but I went into service in January.
So you were drafted?
Yes.
And how old were you?
18.
18. And where did you go to? Did you go to boot camp?
I went to Great Lakes.
Okay, where's that at?
In Michigan. Great Lakes along the lake, Michigan.
Okay, on Lake Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and how did you go? Did you take a train?
Yeah, they put us on a train in Apollo and took us.
And so you went into the Navy?
Yes.
And how long was your training?
I was there in January, February, and March, I believe, part of March.
And what year was that when they drafted you? January of what year?
Of 44.
44. So do you remember Pearl Harbor Day?
Oh, yes. Real well.
How did you hear about it?
On the radio. It was on a Sunday when I heard it. So the day that it happened.
Mm-hmm. Had you been expecting something like that?
No, not really.
So where did you go? Where were you assigned first? Where did you go?
Great Lakes.
And then after that, where did you go?
To Sullivan's, Maryland, to gunnery school.
So you were a gunner?
Yes.
And then what ship did you serve on?
On an LSD.
And where at? In the Pacific?
Yes. In the Philippines was our home base in the Philippines.
What was that like, going to the Philippines?
Well, actually we weren't allowed off the boat, off the ship. We just anchored there. That was our place to go anchor when we had to go in. Those Filipinos, they passed in those small boats or whatever there was, and we wasn't allowed to buy anything on them. Nothing. We wasn't allowed to buy bananas or anything at all. They wasn't allowed to come to a ship or nothing because of dysentery and stuff. They were crummy people. I mean, dirty. They didn't have. Well, it wasn't their fault. They didn't have the stuff, I guess. So I wasn't allowed to shore or anything. And there was one little church there in Leyte, right off the shore, and I would see the women going to church every morning. They'd go with their big home rolled cigars, smoking a big cigar, and going to church. And so I asked the skipper one day, I said, would it be possible for you to take us in a small boat and go over there? I'd like to see inside that church. And he said, so would I. So he said, we'll go. And we went, and here there was no pews or anything in the church. It was just ladies sitting there smoking their homemade cigars, their home-rolled cigars, and no minister or anything. They just sit there, and I guess they was saying prayers or worship. And was only allowed in there, I think, for 5 minutes or something like that, and then we had to leave. And outside of that, we had nothing to do with the Filipino people because they were dysentery. They was afraid of getting dysentery started because they wasn't clean at all. It wasn't their fault, I guess. And they just lived in huts along Leyte. Leyte was a inlet where we would in when it was storms and stuff to protect us. But we wasn't allowed to handle them.
Tell us about the LST. What was that? What kind of boat was it? What was it like?
Landing craft.
Right.
They took troops and jeeps and stuff into the beach when they went to make a landing.
And you were on the crew for the LST? Yeah. And how big were the crew quarters?
Oh, crew quarters wasn't real large. Well, part of my time was on LCT too, when they'd take troops in. They was smaller, but we could still haul tanks and things in, and troops. And then we'd leave them off, and then we'd come back to Leyte.
So which landings were you in on?
Well, just landings around there where they're trying to take the islands and get things secured. So I don't know what the name of them, some of them was. I wasn't, when before the war ended, they had us about ready to go to Japan, but we didn't have to go. The war ended. Truman let them drop them bombs, and that soon settled it.
Was that a relief to you?
Yes, oh man, it was a great relief.
How did you hear about that?
Well, we had the radios. We heard everything was going on everywhere. They had their, not radios that they broadcast like but they had their radios that was just for the personnel, for the people on board ship, the skipper and the officers and them got the news. They knew everything was going on all the time everywhere. Because they had them, radios of some kind that they could talk. They let the officers know everything that was going on. And then they would tell us what was, like we knew as soon as they dropped them bombs in Japan, that were the worst bombs that was ever dropped. Wiped the whole city out at a time. We heard about that right away. So we figured the war was going to be over before too long. Did
you have any idea that they were working on some kind of weapon like that?
No, they didn't tell us that kind of stuff. Not more than that powerful anyway. Mm-hmm. But then the eats aboard the ship weren't good, but they weren't bad. And our cook was head cook was from New Jersey, from Orange, New Jersey, and he was a fairly good cook for, he was the head of the cook. They had to have coffee for you 24 hours a day if you could drink it. But it was, over there you didn't have no fresh water, everything was chlorine water. And you held your nose to drink it, and because you couldn't drink it if you didn't, with the chlorine in it. And then they'd bring out water. The ship would come with water every 3 or 4 months and take the lid off of some of them tanks that they put it down in and then fill them up again with water, but it was chlorine water. So I can't, as soon as now, if they give me any water anywhere that has chlorine in, boy, my nose picks it up right away. I can't. And then they didn't, over there with the guns and stuff, they never give me no hearing aids, blocks. You didn't have anything for in your ears to stop that noise. And when I came home, I went to West Leechburg to work, to Allegate, London, and they hired me right away. The day that I took my test to get in, they said, my goodness, they said, are you hard of hearing? And I said, yeah, I realize I am. So I'm wearing hearing aids now. That helps a lot, but they're a nuisance, of course. And they gave me my first set, but that was all. Mm-hmm. And boy, they're expensive. Real expensive to buy your hearing aids and keep it going. But I got a good daughter and a good son. I just had the 2 children.
You have a very handsome family.
Thank you.
So were you married? Oh, you weren't married then when you went to the war because you were too young. You were too young.
I was too young.
Now, did you have a sweetheart?
Yeah, in a way. But you didn't get time to write. There wasn't nothing to write. And then when we did write, they censored it and tried to hide what you said. So most of it just writing to my mother and father trying to keep them informed a little bit. But I would get packages from the girl that I was seeing some once in a while. If you got it. Sometimes you didn't even get your package, say.
What kind of stuff was in it?
Cookies and that kind of stuff. That's about all they could send to them, anything that wouldn't spoil. My mother should always and my aunts and them would make me boxes and send them.
Did you share them?
Oh, yes. Yeah. When you got a package, everybody gathered around and they let you get the first cookie or whatever was in it out and then look out. By that time, it's gone, which I didn't mind. They all done, everybody shared when they got a package.
What kind of cookies did they send?
Well, just cookies that wouldn't spoil, just regular cookies, sugar cookies and that kind of stuff. Then it's in some candy, sometimes the packages would have candy in.
So how many men were on the LST in the crew?
About 50-something. Oh, they were big.
Bigger than I realized. Of course, if they were big enough to carry tanks, they had to be pretty big.
They were flat bottom, They were rough riding. Because when you kind of hit the waves and stuff, you didn't cut through them, you went over top of them and flop down.
So did you have to wait for relatively calm seas in order to do it, or did you just go ahead anyway?
No, you went ahead anyway. Well, if they gave tornado warnings or something, then you got in, because I saw one time was in Lady Bay, and all the ships would go in there, and I saw one of these big aircraft carriers coming in there one day, and he got caught out in the ocean in the storm. And you know where the flight deck goes way out over the bow? It was smashed down over the bow. The waves and stuff smashed it down over the bow. It was that rough, the water. But you'd see when we'd get in rough seas, you'd look out the side and you'd see a ship way up here. And after a bit it would disappear, and you was way up there. All the waves, it was terrible out there, some storms. But we go through it safe. And one thing that was in my favor was I never got seasick. Most of them got seasick. We had one poor guy, I pitied him. He was from North Carolina, and he would just, when we'd have to go out, he was seasick as soon as they said pull anchor. And then we had several guys, pretty much everybody aboard got seasick. And I wasn't supposed to take the wheel, to steer. I wasn't supposed to be that because I was the gunner's mate. But when we got real rough water out here, the skipper, Reichenbaugh, please report to the wheelhouse, and I knew right away I was going to have to take the wheel because everybody else was seasick. And it was supposed to be on there, and I wasn't supposed to be, but he always rooted me. He liked me. He was, because I was the youngest one aboard ship. Well, there was some in their 20s, but most of them was in their 30s, early 30s, years old. And most of them had families and children, their own. Then the skipper said one day, he said, how do you keep from getting seasick? I said, well, I don't know. I said, I guess my stomach just goes up and down with the waves or something. I said, don't bother me.
How did you wind up in the Navy?
Well, I was drafted, of course, and when I went down to Pittsburgh for my exam the day I had to go, they took us in a bus. They took a bus load of us, and I went straight through. They didn't find anything wrong. And when I come down to the end, I was one of the first ones through because they didn't hold me up in anything, and I went in and they set me down there, and I talked to an officer, and he said, asked me a lot of questions, of course, about school and that kind of stuff. And then he said, what do you want in? And I said, I guess the Army. And he said, why the Army? And I said, well, all my friends that went ahead of me, I said, are in the Army. I said, my brother's in the Army. And he said, you wasn't built for the Army, you was built for the Navy. And he stamped Navy and hold my paper. Thank goodness he did, or I mightn't be here today.
Yeah.
And I was one of the first ones done with my physicals and stuff, so he said, well, you'll just have to sit around where the bus comes this evening, because he said some of these guys won't be through for a while yet. So then they sent us home, was home for 2 weeks. Now the ones that they took, that went to the Armory, they had a month after they took their physical, but the ones that went to the Navy only had 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks I was in boot camp up at Great Lakes, Illinois.
Do you remember the end of the war?
Oh yeah, we was the first ones that knew that it was, over. They put it on, told all the skippers and all the boats, all the ships, and everybody knew it right away. The war ended, they gave up, and of course everybody started celebrating, cheering, and we was in Lady Gulf then. We were anchored when they announced it, because there was a rumor that they was going to send us to Japan, that they was going to make a landing there. And we knew if they made a landing in Japan, there was going to be a lot of lives really lost. So everybody was really excited when they said that they dropped them bombs and that they gave up. And everybody, of course, started celebrating. You didn't have much to celebrate with except cheering and running around. And it was, I suppose, a month or so later, then they brought some different food and stuff out for us. And one thing they brought was a case of Coke and a case of toddy, and that toddy was the best chocolate drink I ever in my life drank. It would come in cans.
How long were you there after the war was over? 4
or 5 months. Because I was youngest aboard ship, and they took you according to how old you was and how much of a family you had. So that, like that guy from North Carolina that I said was sick all the time, or the skipper was the first one to go, and he wasn't that old, he wasn't even married, but they took some of the officers and brought some of them other officers out from states that thought they knew more than we did. Crew kept getting smaller if it wasn't big enough, then they would move you to another boat of the same kind. And they kept they kept moving you to different ships, you know. Enough to have a crew to run a ship. Well, then finally, so I was the only one who was still, went out there, was still there because I was the youngest. And then finally one day they said, Reichenbaugh, they said, pack up because you're leaving tomorrow for home. And I said, oh, thank God. Well, they took us to one of these great big ships. I mean, it was enormous. And it was packed with men, you know, and everything. And I got a little bit acquainted with another guy there. And I said, boy, this is going to be some trip home with all these guys aboard here. And he said, oh, man, he said, I don't know what we're going to do. And well, that night they assigned me and him to quarters down below. And it was right above the engine room. And you're just shaking and hot. Oh, you couldn't stand it. And so I said to him, let's go up and sleep on top deck. If they don't catch us, we'll be all right. So we went up, took his blanket, and went up on top deck. About the middle of the night, I felt somebody kicking me on the bottom of the feet. And here it was an officer. And he said, what are you doing up here? And I said, oh, I couldn't stand it down there. I said, right above the engine room. I said, I couldn't sleep. And he said, what's your name? I told him, and he had a record there, of course. He looked and he said, oh, you was a gunner's mate? And I said, yes. He said, I'm going to have a job for you tomorrow on your way home. And then he asked the other guy who was with me what he done, and he told him, and he said he was a cook. And he said, I'll have a job for you too. He said, you can report to my office the first thing in the morning. And he said, we'll assign you to another quarters. So my job was, they gave everybody a little card of different colors, and then say, yellow's going to have breakfast first tomorrow morning. And so I had to stand up there, I had a gun and everything, and watch them guys, and they had to show me their yellow card that they was first. And if they wasn't, then I had to shove them out of line. And then take the other guys maybe had a red card, and they'd take them next for breakfast. And that was my job on the way home, seeing if I had the right colored card was in that line for first breakfast and stuff. So then they assigned me different bunks too. I slept up with the crew. Had it pretty nice. Not nice compared to what you have here, but for where I was the first night. So that's where I was till I come, and we stopped at Hawaii for one night, and then we come on to California. So we went through under the Golden Gate Bridge, because that was the old saying aboard ship, you'll see the Golden Gate in 48, but it happened before that. Then I got in, then they put us, of course, Navy base there, and they started signing you when you to go home, and everybody was going home, and I wasn't. I knew I wasn't for discharge, but you should get home for leave. Mm-hmm. Asked to see the main officer one day, and they said, well, we'll see if he'll see you, and he took me in, and he said, what's your problem? And I told him how long I'd been there. Oh my goodness, he said, you should have been going home before this for leave. And he said, what? And he got my record out right away, and he said, oh, he said, I'm sorry. He said, we missed you. He said, you should have been gone 2 weeks ago. So he said, I'll tell you what. He said, I got a trip into town, he said, in about an hour. And he said, you be packed. And he said, you'll get in a Jeep with me. And he said, I'll take you to the railroad station and make sure you get out of here. And I said, well, thank you. And he did. And he took me to the railroad station. And I got in there, and I asked for a Pullman train home. Didn't have any. They said you have to ride in the coach. And I said, oh, I can't. That's a 3-day trip night. Sitting there. And so then they said, you won't go till this evening. So I went in for lunch into a restaurant, and it was filled. And I said, there was one seat, and there was a lady sitting there by herself, an older lady. And she said, you can sit with me. And I went over there and sat down, and she said, are you waiting to go home? And I said, yeah, and I told her what happened. She said, you're going with me right after we eat lunch. She said, I work in the railroad station. She said, I'll see what I can do for you. I said, well, that would sure be nice of you. So I said, well, I'll get your lunch for you. And she said, oh, no, I'm getting your lunch for you. And after what you did, and so we went over to the train station right as soon as we ate. And she said, give me your ticket. Come on in here and sit down. Wait. I gave her my ticket, and she said, now this is if I can get you Pullman, she said, you know it'll cost you more money. And I said, I don't care. So in about half hour she came back, and she said, you're getting on a Pullman at 6 o'clock tonight. She said, you'll be on your, and she said, it makes 2 stops between here and Chicago. She said, it's one of the fast ones. And she said, you'll have to pay the difference. And I said, oh, I'll gladly do that. I got on the train that night, and I was on there 2 nights, and the next morning while I was in Chicago. Then I got off there, and I had to catch, of course, just a regular train home. I went out, got the taxi, and I told him when I was catching my train, and he said, "Oh, my," he said, "that's great the other side of the city." He said, "Well, we'll have to break the records in driving." No, did we go across that city. And when we got out, he said, "Get in there right away." He said, "That train's getting ready to leave." And when I went through the gate, they said, what are you for? And I said what train I was getting, and they said, "Get in through the gate right away." They said, "They're closing the gate." They said, "That train's starting to pull out." Oh boy, it wasn't no pullman. Till I got to Pittsburgh, I looked like I was colored. It was one of them old trains that the smoke and stuff come in the windows, and oh, you just about smothered. But I didn't care. So I got to Pittsburgh, I called my mother and dad right away and told them I was there, and because I knew they'd come to get me right away. But I said, "Don't hurry," because I said, "I got to shower and change clothes and everything before I get out of here." So I said, give me an hour and a half or so anyway. And I said, "Now I'll get something to bite to eat and get some clean clothes on." Because as in whites then, it was warm. But when I got off of that train, they weren't white. They were more black than they were white, because it was one of them old trains, and when you the smoke just come in at the windows like, oh. And then the guy was sitting beside me, he on the train, he was the same. He was as black as I was from the dirt. And then finally I just happened to look out the window. It was just getting daylight in the morning. And I looked out the window and I saw, that was one of them signs when you go from one state to another, they say. I saw it said, this big sign I saw out there said Pennsylvania, right along the railroad tracks. And I looked at the guy next to me. I knew he didn't see it. And I said, "We're in Pennsylvania." He said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Smell the air." I said, "We're in Pennsylvania." And he said, "Oh, come on." And just by that time, where they announced over the intercom, we just now came into Pennsylvania. He was going on to New Jersey. So he said, "You saw something, I told you." And I said, "Yeah, I saw the sign that said Pennsylvania." So then I got my supper and got a shower and stuff. And by that time, my mother and dad was there. Oh, my dad wasn't. He was working. But my brother and his wife and my mother came down and picked me up. And again, I got home, my dad was just getting off of work, and was he ever tickled? Oh man, I had good parents, both of them. And my brother, I just had one brother. My sister died when she was 2 days old. She never lived. And then he should have been the oldest. And then I had a brother, he was older than me. And then Northern Home too, he got married, and he married a beautiful, wonderful woman.
Did he serve in the military too?
He served in the Army. He was lucky. It had something to do with airplanes. And he's done something to all the planes every morning. I just don't know what it was. But they never sent him overseas. They kept him at that base, and that was his job every morning, to do this to the motor on these planes, whatever it was. So they kept him there. And then that's why when he got married down there. And then they gave them a place on the base to live together, an apartment. So he got home, he had 3 children, and then he got this bone cancer. He died.
How old was he?
Around early 50s. He got the cancer, though, in his late 40s.
So what did he do after the war then? Was he still a mechanic then?
No, he went to West Leesburg, Allegheny, London. And both of us did. We had an uncle there that was a superintendent of the carpenter shop, and he could help you get in, somebody had help. Of course, he was home before I was, because he was older than I was. So he was already working at the mill when I got out of the Navy. He worked at one of them big annealing lines. My uncle said, "Did you put an application in at the mill?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." And he said, "Well, I'll talk to him and see what I can do for you." Well, then about 2 weeks they called me to come down. And I worked in the shipping office as a shipping clerk. But it was 24 hours a day. I mean, I had to be there. You work night turn too, because I build trucks and stuff when they come in, what they're getting. And them truck drivers, they don't know to stay home at night. So I worked turns. And then finally one day, Ted Brewer he was the head guy over all the firemen and everybody, and he come to me and he said, "Boy," he said, "I looked up your record, Dean." He said, "You've been president in the North Hall of Firemen." And he said, "That's a good outfit up there." He said, "You've been everything up there, trustees." And he said, "I'm going to have an opening here." He said, because they was threatening that they was going to put computers, was going to take our places in the office, And he said, "I'll have a job for you." He said, "You'll work for me if you want to." And I said, "Well, I'll try it." But he said, you'll be in 24-hour call all the time. And, well, that was kind of a mistake, but Ted Brewer was a good guy, though. I just took it and was only on there for less than a year, and my wife got lung cancer. I had to take her to the hospital, and that was in February, 1st of February, took her to the hospital. She never got out of the hospital till September. That lung cancer was just eating her up, and then they sent her home. They surprised me one day, and I went down, and they said, we're sending your wife home tomorrow. I said, what am I going to do? They said, oh, we'll furnish you a hospital bed and stuff, and we'll have a nurse that will come in every day. And so then she lived till about 10 days till after Christmas, and she passed away.
Sorry.
And when she passed away, I doubt she weighed 50 pounds. She was just skin and bone, and she was a good wife, a wonderful wife. And then we had two children, a boy and a girl.
When did you meet her?
Well, I got shortly after I come home from the Navy. We got married. Because that the girl that I was sending me packages and stuff, that I went with we went to dance and stuff. That was before I went to the service. Here she met another guy, and he was home before me, and because I was young. She was engaged when I come home. Well, she hadn't told me about what was going on. So then I started going to the dances myself after I got home, and then I met my wife that I married. The girl that got married, right after I got home, the other girlfriend, she got sick and didn't live long after I was home. So I've had good days and I've had some bad ones. I kept working, and I didn't mind then going out so much, because I was on 24-hour call at the mill, and they knew I was home by myself. Gee, my phone was ringing sometime before I got home, because they gave me a phone to carry too. Sometime before I got home, I'd say, turn around, come right back, and I'd go right back. They had problems. Because any time on some big operations, there was a lot of operation under the floor too, and they had that kerosene and stuff that they used to make steel, and it was dripping down in. So when they go to have a breakdown, they wasn't allowed to burn down in there till they called me or Ted Brewer or the fire chief, and we had to get the labor pool up there and clean it all out to make sure that because with that kerosene and stuff down in there and rags hanging, because them guys was careless at work. They had big buckets there, barrels for them to throw their dirty rags in. You think I'd throw them in, they'd just toss them over there to the pit and they would get down in and it'd hang somewhere. And one spark or something would start them burning. So I had to get the labor pool and clean all them rags and stuff out before I could leave them burned, whatever was broke down. So then finally, and then I retired. And after I retired, the kids said, because I'd go to Myrtle Beach with them when they went on their vacation and stuff. Why was going on bus trips? Butler Motors had bus trips, all the time, nice bus trips. So I said, I don't know. And they said, well, why don't you try one? So I went on a bus trip, and that's where I met my wife that I got now. On one of those bus trips to South Carolina. Her husband died in Coal Bank with a heart attack. So we've been married ever since. And then this happened. Versus why she has a room and I have one. I couldn't come here at first. I went over to Tanning Care Center after I got out of the hospital here. So that's my life.
So do you remember the Depression?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I can remember my dad. He was working at an old Apollo steel mill at the time. Then everybody didn't have phones either, but my grandmother lived right next door to us, and she had a phone because she was postmaster of Spring Church. They would call her house, and I was down there every day at my grandmother's because I loved all them. I remember them telling me, well, run up and tell your dad he don't have no work tonight. They called, and he had very little work during the Depression, And then he went into work one morning to go to work at the Apollo mill, and everything was closed. That guy never gave them no notice. None of them poor guys ever got a pension or anything. He just had a big sign up out front, closed, and he just shut it down. And
so how did you get by?
Well, I was married, of course, at the time, but my mother and dad, Dad knew the guy that was at the head of the Apollo Ridge schools real well. And right away they offered Dad, they knew he was a good worker, and they said, hey, we need a janitor for the new school. I said, how about you taking it? And so he took that, he cleaned the rooms, and of course it was fired by coal then. In the winter he had to be over there at 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes firing up, to get that whole It wasn't the high school, but it was the elementary school. It was right there in Spring Church. It was a new school.